Lester Brown's strategy here is arbitrary as near as I can tell. That is, it doesn't map to a necessary reality, but it's a useful construct. His idea is that with reducing carbon 80% by 2020, this all-important goal for humanity, we have two options. We need to think of it two ways. One, we need to prevent the establishment of new coal-fired power plants. And how to do that? This chart shows it. To increase the efficiency of the energy we use now so that our demand actually goes down rather than up, requiring those new plants. And that renewable energy should be used to take us from where we are today with coal-fired power plants and shut them down. Not a bad way to think about it. These charts at the beginning, remember they're here, come back and refer to them frequently. It will make your job of understanding this all much, much easier as you sort through his dense work.
Chapter 11. Raising Energy Efficiency. As noted in Chapter 3, the Himalayan glaciers that feed the major rivers in Asia during the dry season are melting, and some of them could disappear entirely in a matter of decades, shrinking the region's grain harvest. We also noted that, if the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets melt, sea level will rise 12 meters, 39 feet. The ice melting effects of climate change alone could increase the number of failing states to a point where civilization would begin to unravel. We are faced with civilization threatening climate change, and a need to massively reduce carbon emissions and to do it quickly. We do not need to wait for future temperature rises to see that we are in trouble. The melting just described warrants a crash program to cut carbon emissions. One of the goals of Plan B is to re-establish a balance between carbon emissions and nature's capacity to sequester carbon by cutting net carbon dioxide, CO2, emissions 80% by 2020. This will halt the rise in atmospheric CO2, stabilizing it below 400 parts per million, ppm, up only modestly from the 384 ppm in 2007. It will also help keep future temperature rise to a minimum. Such a basic economy restructuring in time to avoid catastrophic climate disruption will be challenging, but how can we face the next generation if we do not try? Our plan to cut net CO2 emissions 80% by 2020 includes stopping deforestation and an even more ambitious effort to cut fossil fuel use. The latter has two major components: raising energy efficiency to offset all projected demand growth, as discussed in this chapter, and developing the Earth's rich array of renewable energy resources, in order to close down all coal and oil-fired power plants, as discussed in the next chapter. In laying out Plan B, we exclude the oft-discussed option of CO2 sequestration at coal-fired power plants. Given the costs and the lack of investor interest in the technology, there is reason to doubt that carbon sequestration will be economically viable on a meaningful scale by 2020. And similarly, we do not count on a build-up in nuclear power. Our assumption is that new openings of nuclear power plants worldwide will simply offset the closing of aging plants, with no overall growth in capacity. If we use full cost pricing requiring utilities to absorb the costs of disposing of nuclear waste, of decommissioning the plant when it is worn out, and of insuring the reactors against possible accidents and terrorist attacks, building nuclear plants in a competitive electricity market is simply not economical. Beyond the economic costs are the political questions. If we say that expanding nuclear power is an important part of our energy future, do we mean for all countries, or only for some countries? If the latter, who makes the A list and the B list of countries? And who enforces the listings? For reference, world electricity generation totaled 18.5 trillion kilowatt-hours in 2006. Of this, 2/3 came from fossil fuels, 40% from coal, 6% from oil, and 20% from natural gas, 15% from nuclear, 16% from hydropower, and 2% or so from other renewables. The average US home uses roughly 10,000 kilowatt-hours of electricity per year, so 1 billion kilowatt-hours is enough to supply 100,000 US homes. Since coal supplies 40% of the world's electricity, but accounts for over 70% of the electrical sector's CO2 emissions, the first priority is to reduce demand enough to avoid constructing any new coal-fired power plants. In the next chapter we focus on phasing out coal-fired power plants. This may appear to be a novel idea, particularly to energy planners in countries such as China and India, but it is not. For example, in Europe, Germany has cut coal use 37% since 1990 through efficiency gains, and by substituting wind-generated electricity for that from coal. The United Kingdom has cut coal use 43%, largely by replacing it with North Sea natural gas. In early 2007, some 150 new coal-fired power plants were planned in the United States. Then public opposition began to mount. California, which imports 20% of its electricity, prohibited the signing of any new contracts to import electricity produced with coal. Several other states, including Florida, Texas, Minnesota, Washington, and Kansas, followed, refusing licenses for coal-fired power plants or otherwise preventing their construction. Coal's future took a telling blow in July 2007, when Citigroup downgraded coal company stocks across the board and recommended that clients switch to other energy stocks. In August, coal took another hit when U.S. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid of Nevada, who had been opposing 3 coal-fired power plants planned for his own state, announced that he was extending his opposition to building coal-fired power plants anywhere in the world. Investment analysts and political leaders are now beginning to see what has been obvious for some time to scientists such as NASA's James Hansen, who says that it makes no sense to build coal-fired power plants when we will have to bulldoze them in a few years. Banning the bulb. Perhaps the quickest, easiest, and most profitable way to reduce electricity use worldwide, thus cutting carbon emissions, is simply to change light bulbs. Replacing the inefficient incandescent light bulbs that are still widely used today with new compact fluorescents, CFLs, can reduce electricity use by 3/4. The energy saved by replacing a 100-watt incandescent bulb with an equivalent CFL over its lifetime is sufficient to drive a Toyota Prius hybrid car from New York to San Francisco. Over its lifetime, each standard 13-watt CFL will reduce electricity bills by roughly $30. And though a CFL may cost twice as much as an incandescent, it lasts 10 times as long. Since it uses less energy, it also means fewer CO2 emissions. Each one reduces energy used by the equivalent of 200 pounds of coal over its lifetime. Less coal burning means reduced air pollution, making lighting efficiency an obviously attractive option for fast-growing economies plagued with polluted air, such as China and India. The world may be moving toward a political tipping point away from inefficient light bulbs. In February 2007, Australia announced it would phase out the sale of incandescent light bulbs by 2010, replacing them with CFLs. Canada soon followed, saying it would phase out incandescent sales by 2012. In mid-March, a US coalition of environmental groups joined with Philips Lighting to launch an initiative to shift to more efficient bulbs in all of the country's estimated 4 billion light sockets by 2016. By mid-2007, some 15 states either had passed or were considering legislation to restrict or ban the sale of incandescent light bulbs. The proposed legislation in New York, for example, would phase out incandescents by 2012, 4 years ahead of the coalition's deadline. And with a dozen or so others restricting or proposing to restrict use in one way or another, pressure is building to pass legislation making this shift nationwide. The European Union, EU, with 27 member countries, announced in March 2007 that it plans to cut carbon emissions 20% by 2020, with part of the cut coming from replacing incandescent bulbs with CFLs. In the United Kingdom, the civic group Ban the Bulb has been vigorously pushing for a ban on incandescents since early 2006. Further east, the Moscow city government is urging its residents to switch to compact fluorescents. Brazil, hit by a nationwide electricity shortage in 2002, responded with an ambitious program to replace incandescents with CFLs. As a result, an estimated half of its light sockets now contain these efficient bulbs. In 2007, China, working with the Global Environment Facility, announced a plan to replace all its incandescents with more efficient lighting within a decade. Greenpeace is urging the government of India to ban incandescents in order to cut carbon emissions. Since roughly 640 million of the 650 million bulbs sold each year in this fast-growing economy are the old inefficient incandescents, the potential for cutting carbon emissions, reducing air pollution, lowering the frequency of blackouts, and saving consumers money is huge. Point at the industry level, Philips, the world's largest lighting manufacturer, is going to stop marketing incandescents in Europe by 2016. And the European Lamp Companies Federation, the Bulb Manufacturers Trade Association, is supporting a rise in EU lighting efficiency standards that would lead to a facade of incandescent bulbs. Retailers are joining the switch too. Walmart, the world's largest retailer, announced a marketing campaign in November 2006 to boost its sales of compact fluorescents to 100 million by the end of 2007, more than doubling its annual sales of such bulbs. And Currys, Britain's largest electrical retail chain, announced in 2007 that it would discontinue selling incandescent light bulbs. For office buildings, commercial outlets, and factories, where linear, tubular, fluorescents are widely used, the key to cutting electricity use is shifting to the most advanced models, which are even more efficient than CFLs. Since linear fluorescents are long-lasting, many of those now in use rely on an earlier, less energy-efficient technology. An even newer lighting technology, light-emitting diodes or LEDs, uses only 1/5 as much electricity as the old-fashioned incandescent bulbs. Already, New York City has replaced traditional bulbs with LEDs in many of its traffic lights, cutting its annual bill for maintenance and electricity by $6 million. LED costs are still high, however, discouraging widespread consumer use. In addition to switching bulbs themselves, huge energy savings can be gained just by turning lights off when not in use. There are numerous technologies for reducing electricity used for lighting, including motion sensors that turn lights off when spaces are unoccupied, such as in washrooms, hallways, and stairwells. In cities, dimmers can be used to reduce street light intensity, and timers can turn off outside lights that illuminate monuments or other landmarks when people are asleep. Dimmers can also be used to take advantage of daylighting to reduce the intensity of interior lighting. Shifting to CFLs in homes, to the most advanced linear fluorescents in office buildings, commercial outlets, and factories, and to LEDs in traffic lights would cut the world's share of electricity used for lighting from 19% to 7%. This would save enough electricity to avoid building 705 coal-fired power plants. By way of comparison, today there are 2,370 coal-fired plants in the world. In a world facing new evidence almost daily of global warming and its consequences, a quick and decisive victory is needed in the battle to cut carbon emissions and stabilize climate. A rapid shift to the most energy-efficient lighting technologies would provide just such a victory, generating momentum for even greater advances in climate stabilization. Energy-efficient appliances. Although many people know that CFLs use only 1/4 as much electricity as incandescent light bulbs, considerably fewer know that a similar range of efficiencies exists for many household appliances, such as refrigerators. The U.S. Energy Policy Act of 2005 included a rise in efficiency standards that will reduce electricity demand enough to avoid building 29 coal-fired power plants. Other provisions in the Act, such as tax incentives that encourage the adoption of energy-efficient technologies, a shift to more combined heat and power generation, and the adoption of real-time pricing of electricity, a measure that will discourage optional electricity use during peak demand periods, would cut electricity demand enough to avoid building an additional 37 coal-fired Power plants.